right? How many other people? So total low stakes, just quick moment, or turn to the other student. So tell your neighbor what it was that bothered you about that. And so then you get to talk, and then that creates noise, and then you can say, well, what were some of the things that bothered you? And they've already told somebody, so it's not as hard to tell the class as a whole. Just a couple of little moments. Moving on, totally generic example number 3. And this is another one where I've asked them to create a structure around something that isn't obviously structured. So select 3 bits. A line or 2 equals 1 bit. You think it would be worthwhile to memorize, put on a poster, or have on a t-shirt. And mark those lines in your text with a specific color or style so that you can see them easily. And I like to do things that involve seeing stuff so that they can think about proportions or how many or how close are they together. So that was the part that really got to, so what's going on there? Or, oh, they're really scattered, or oh, they're all at the end. What can we think about with respect to that? And then the second part, break the reading into sections around each of your bits. So if this is kind of the center moment for you, this is the shiny moment, what goes with that? So this is another way of getting at identity, another way of thinking about sections and kind of how ideas connect and looking at the piece as a system. On the back side of the handout, I've got a couple of very specific examples for some piece. The first piece is David Foster Wallace's Canyon Commencement speech, that This is Water, which I think it's used in a variety of contexts, so I just went ahead and used that. And I'll give you another thing that I do. I used to make this much harder on myself, but I do regular discussions where I don't say anything, I just take notes. And the students talk for 50 minutes. And my goal is to keep a straight face and not react and not say anything and it's fabulous. First time I did it, I was scared out of my mind. I was like, how is this possibly going to work? Can this possibly work? And within about 3 seconds, I was sold. Because the very first question that a student asked another student was one I could have never anticipated needing to be asked or answered. It was something that I took so much for granted, and yet it was fundamental, and it was a real block for, as it turns out, a number of students in the room to understanding and thinking about the piece and thinking about the author's goals. So it was something that had to be addressed before they could move on. So they kind of do their own little therapy session in many ways, but also because you've got 25, 30 minds in the room, there's almost always some student who has paid closer attention to one aspect than another. And as from some of our critical theory discussion, or our critical thinking discussions, we learned that in a variety of contexts, students tend to listen to each other more than they listen to their instructor. And so they really tend to take that in. I used to have them do all kinds of writing in preparation, and I was grading sometimes a couple of times 500-word assignments about each of the readings that I did, and that worked for about 3 years, and then I had a mental breakdown. How I do it now, and it seems to be working, is I just have them, I give them kind of this is exactly the homework I gave them for such a discussion. And then they grade each other. This still involves a little paperwork on my part, but they grade each other 5, 7, 9. So, and they grade themselves too. So I say 1, 2, me is what they write on their paper, and then they write the name of 2 students who really facilitated their understanding or appreciation, deepened their understanding in some way. And I have some handouts about roles in discussion, atmosphere, different things, and we talk about how discussion works as a practice as well in preparation to this. I don't just do this cold. And then they give themselves a score: 5 for showing up and breathing, 7 if you say something, and 9 if you think that was you think you did, or if you are giving somebody else a really strong score for their participation, for their facilitating of understanding. And we do have to talk about noise does not equal quality. But the other, the way that I actually grade it is I just tally. And so students who get a shout out, I just tally marks, and then I break it down kind of on a loose curve. So the person who gets the most, or sometimes there's 2 or 3 people who tie and all get really strong scores, they get 10s. The next group get 9s, the next group get 8s, and then 7s. so that becomes, it takes, to do about 75 of those in Italian, it takes me probably about an hour. But it's worth its weight in terms of outcome. For example, one of the questions I asked, identify the thing that David Foster Wallace refers to that are imagined. We were dealing with this in the context of 145, and so from a teacher point of view, I was thinking it would give them the opportunity to talk about evidence, because he's talking about hypothetical situations in that piece. Like, well, you know, what if you think about that mother and you consider that her crying child is because of this and all the stresses that are going on in her life. Well, that's nothing that's documented that you can really nail down as evidence. And so that was what was in my head. What they came up with, as they usually do, was so much more brilliant than any of that. They used that idea about imagined and talked about how much he was constructing an imagined world for the reader from start to finish, and the different environments that he was making, and kind of how he created a manifest world for the reader that made it very easy to move through the piece. And they began talking about concrete aspects of composition, and I was just like, oh my god, this is so cool, because they're smarter than I am. Identify any metaphors or analogies, because we've been talking about the logic of metaphor or analogy as a valid arguments system. And list the stereotypes that David Foster Wallace refers to, then list details he uses as shorthand to indicate those stereotypes. And that became actually, in our overt language about composition, we call those strands, where you see echoes of different pieces, but they realized that there were things that he was using in talking about particular stereotypes that showed up throughout the piece and help to create an organizational sensibility. So, yeah, they do so much more than I ever think they're going to, although sometimes they do a hell of a lot less. And then I have, so there's a couple of specific assignments like that, and then I have some sample pairings down below so that you can see how a homework activity might go with an in-class activity. And the fact of the matter is that the starts usually for the in-class activity and the homework activity aren't really that different. Sometimes I'll bundle more things into the home, sometimes I'll pull things from the home and start the class with that, because they're the same kind of thing, and they're actually meant to produce the same thing. Yeah, it's just kind of how much I want them to do to prepare, or how much I want to have to start with, or how concretely I think we need to begin the class. So sometimes that will depend on kind of reading the personality of the class, how much they like and how much they can handle. My earlier section's a little clingier, and so that I start them with a more concrete aspect, and what did you get for highlighting something. My latter class, I can send them really far, and they will run with it. And so we can start from a much more abstract place, or a much deeper place in our conversation. So sometimes I'll add or subtract steps. And then below that, I have a list of some sample activities. One of my favorite things to do, and one of their favorite things, it turns out to do because it often involves colors, is to transform whatever they're reading, thinking, talking about into some other form. So this is how I stumbled upon this. I was teaching a section of Freud's interpretation of dreams, which can be a little challenging. And I had them, on the fly one day, I had them try to draw the process that Freud talks about, like how it goes from manifest, or how it gets to manifest content, from latent to manifest content. And the things were so cool that I started trying it in other aspects. And so now, make a picture of whatever it is. Sometimes I'll do it for poetry, sometimes I do it for philosophical pieces. It has to have some kind of imagistic component to it in order to be able to just make a picture. But it works surprisingly well, and it often shows me at a glance how much they understand. It's a rapid fire assessment. I can look at one picture of Freud and go, oh, these people, oh, they totally have it. These people do not. And so we can then talk about their pictures, and that helps them to get what is actually going on, and they can see how they were understanding things differently. What led them to a different conclusion. So you can do things, I've done a number of these in class already this quarter. Make a PowerPoint slide. Because when you do a slide, you have to think about what are you getting your audience to focus on, the kind of shiny moments, but you also have to have the stuff that you're referring to, whether it's in your text or kind of your background stories like I'm doing now. You have the thing that holds the place that they focus on, but you have the other stuff. So there's kind of a ratio proportion, and they have to suss out what are the differences between those things in order to make make a slide. So I talked about pictures, a web page, which is something I haven't done, but I kind of want to do, like have them design a web page that would help students to help readers to access different points of the material, because I think like spatializing and arranging those can work really well. I haven't tried it yet. Timelines, charts, what is the order in which they tell you something about something, and what is the actual order in which it happens? You might think about this as the Tarantino experiment. You know, what order does Pulp Fiction actually occur in, and what is the order in which it is shown to you? But a lot of pieces actually work that way. You have backstories, forward stories, and so that helps them to track those differences and to think about what other options are there, what are the effects of creating these kinds of tensions and juxtapositions and arrangement, that it makes it evident to them. Make a study guide or make a quiz. These are some of my favorites. We can talk about questions, we can talk about how you put those things together. Make a very small study guide, make a really extensive study guide. I'll have them make a long study guide. You have 2 8 by 11 sheets of paper. You can put whatever you want on it. And then they come into class and I'll say, okay, now you have to fold one of those pieces of paper in half. A piece of binder paper in half, you only get the front side. You put on it. So that kind of transference and focusing. I talked about discussions, and I could talk about discussions for another 2 hours. My oldest trick is pick however many quotes, just to do a standard close reading. Pick so many quotes that have to do with this. Pick so many quotes that have to do with this. Pick so many quotes that have this effect on you from this character that show this. It doesn't matter what. Pick something. Then they come in with something concrete. At the very least, they have looked and they have found and they have made a decision. And then you can do all kinds of things from there. You can put them into groups to compare the quotes, pick one, put that on the board. You can just have, okay, I want you, and you to put your quotes up on the board. And you can do things like, well, what kind of picture does that make? What kind of argument does that make about what's important in that story if we only look at these? How does extracting material versus diving into material do? We can do close reading moments. What are the key words in that quote? What makes that a quotable moment? How does it actually function in terms of its specific textuality? What does this elide? What does it point to? There's all kinds of things you can do with that. And then I hinted at this already, the variations on pair, square, share. Have you guys heard of that before? I don't always do the squaring, but I do a heck of a lot of pairing just on the fly when I feel like something's not happening. Just do a quick, okay, tell the person next to you whatever it is that we're talking about. And I'll do that with quotes, I'll do it with what did you get, I'll do it with any variety of things. But that moment of sharing and checking in seems to really build confidence and kind of help them begin to think about something from outside their own lens, getting outside of their skull-sized prisons. And so, and one of my other favorite questions is, what weren't you sure about? What were you sure about? What weren't you sure about? Because that makes it okay to be unsure, and then I actually get feedback on what they're taking in and what they're not getting. But I think that you have to create a culture in which you make the not knowing a part of the learning. Because that's what we're here for. So that's kind of a little bit of my bag of tricks. It was kind of interesting to try and stop after almost 20, I started doing this in 1994. So almost 20 years of just doing this nightly. I had to go like, what do I do?